Yesterday, we'd heard from Mohammed and Asifa about the experiences of staff from the minoritized ethnic groups who work in HE and in research libraries. And of course, one of the ways that we can improve that experience, or help to improve it anyway, is to ensure that we have a more diverse workforce. And if I reflect on my sort of more than 25-year career at the University of Southampton, it's obvious that we've made a lot of progress, mostly in the last few years, it has to be said. But there is still a way to go. When I started, we were almost a completely white staff group, and now we are definitely more diverse, but it's still noticeable that our diversity is better, but more in the lower pay grades. So I'm really, really pleased to welcome Alison Harding and Sarah Jones from University of Wales, Trinity St David, who are coming to talk to us about their efforts to develop a more equitable recruitment process.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for the introduction. And just for those who visually impaired or unable to see the screen, I'm a middle-aged woman with grey short hair. I've got round green glasses, green eyes, freckles, and I'm wearing a red top. And my nail polish today is blue. And Sarah can introduce herself. Sarah.
Hey, I'm Sarah Jones. I'm a woman in her 40s, white woman, blonde hair, shoulder length, wearing a black top, brown eyes. Very nice to meet you.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So as was noted, we're from the University of Wales, Trinity St David. I'm the Executive Head of Library and Learning Resources. And for those unaware, we're a university in West Wales, multiple merged. I have a number of organisations, notably St David's College, Lampeter, Trinity University College and Swansea Metropolitan. So we're over a wide area in a fairly rural area of West Wales. So thank you for the invitation to speak on this work, and hopefully it'll be interesting for us to speak on it, but interesting for you to come along on the journey with us. So just to say that the process is ongoing. And it is requiring us to identify and overcome intentional and unintentional barriers arising from bias and systematic discriminatory structures that we have in place. This means that we must continually challenge ourselves and also recognise our own biases and their impact. We recognise that we need to go on a learning and unlearning journey around our workforce. We recognise our own privilege here as two white middle-class women, and what skills and experiences we need to be able to provide services to our community and more broadly. So it's not just about recruitment, although it says equity on recruitment on the front slide, but it's also around workforce development for our existing teams. So equity, where we've called it equity in recruitment, talks of fairness of opportunity, but also acknowledging that we don't all start in the same place and we need to make adjustments to reflect those injustices. This differs obviously from equality and inclusion, which talks about treating everybody the same, but failing then to recognise societal barriers that some people face. This image on the front slide is from the archives of St David's College, Lampeter. So clearly they had a robust recruitment policy. It was a time when women weren't able to be ordained in the Church in Wales clergy. It was a time when women weren't admitted to the college. Women were admitted not until the mid-60s as students. So clearly there was a lot of societal barriers for women at St David's College, Lampeter, and that was talked around a lot in our bicentenary last year. So if we have the second slide, Sarah. Okay, so what we just wanted to talk about a little bit is some of the drivers for the work that we're doing, and Sarah will talk a little bit about the work in the next slide onwards. And some of this you may have touched on already in some of the presentations and the conversations you've had yesterday. So, but just some broader context in terms of sector and wider community. Just to note, this is another archive image from People's Collections Wales. And it's the official opening of the library at Morrison Road in Sandfields. For those who know the area, that's Sandfields in Port Talbot. I'm not sure how diverse you'd say that grouping is, but you can probably make some conclusions around where power lied in that photo. But I thought it was a rather interesting image from 1960s libraries. So in 2015, you're probably aware that CILIP did a workforce survey. There was another survey last year, and I'm not sure, I haven't seen the results of that survey, but the headlines of that were that the workforce was around 86,000. It'd be interesting to see what the 2022 survey tells us. There was a significant gender pay gap. Women dominated the workforce. I'm not sure whether this was white women or global majority women. Women were underrepresented in senior management. Just let me turn my page. And it was a highly qualified workforce. High earners were more likely to hold professional qualifications than those of low earning. So it was quite high, it is and was quite a hierarchical workforce based on qualifications you had rather than experience or skills necessarily. It was an aging workforce, and I would still probably say it is an increasingly aging workforce. And we've had conversations around the challenges of what that demographic gives us in WELF, which is the Welsh Higher Education Libraries Forum. It had low ethnic diversity in 2015 at least. SCONL, the Society of College, National and University Libraries, did a BAME, or Global Majority Staff Experience Survey, in 2019. That is available online if it's not been talked around already. And just to give you the lowlights, 44% of BAME staff surveyed had experienced racism at the hands of either their work colleague or a service user, or both. 65% of those who had experienced racism had reported it, and 80% of those who'd reported the racism had said that it had not been resolved to their satisfaction. Just over half of respondents, that's 53%, did feel their workplace valued equality and diversity and had an inclusive culture. There was a SCONL EDI benchmarking project in 2021, and this has led to the inclusion of a number of EDI questions in the SCONL dataset. So for those unaware, SCONL every year asks its members for a quite detailed dataset around budget, staffing, resources, and additional in this year were around the ethnic makeup of our workforces. And that's not just kind of headline numbers, it's really around what contracts they hold, whether they're fixed term, part-time, the pay levels and their level in the organisation. This will tell us what our workforces look like in quite granular detail, hopefully be able to benchmark, and hopefully then to potentially identify good practice and share across the sector. So we're all aware of the Black Lives Matter movement, which grew from prominence following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, which spoke of injustice and the lack of access to those societal norms and courtesies that we, as white people, accept as the norm. The decolonisation agenda of cultural institutions speaks of enriching our collections and services, which was touched on in the introduction. And we can only fully do this if our workforces also reflect the richness of humanity and at all levels. So there's been much work done already in the sector, and this continues, but we at UWTSD Libraries wanted to take ownership of the challenge and the problems, rather than wait on the sidelines or wait for somebody else to fix it. Often in Wales, we often talk about it being difficult to recruit from the global majority, as we are not a diverse society, but this is not the case and can be seen as an excuse to do nothing. The Welsh Government E&D stats from 2008 talk of 5% of the population describing themselves as Asian, Black, or being of mixed or multiple ethnic groups, and from another ethnic group. The survey will help us to clarify whether this is reflected in our workforces, and the SCONL work as well can tell us what level these sit at. So some of us may have diverse workforces to a degree, and in some ways UWTSD is fairly diverse, but they're not in senior roles. I have a senior team currently of 10 people, all are white. UWTSD Libraries does have team members from the global majority, but these mainly are in our English campuses or learning centres. Wales and the Welsh Government does have a range of initiatives around the anti-racist agenda, and I'm sure you're aware of them, including an anti-racist action plan. So it's clear that the political landscape within our nation is one of inclusion and celebrating diversity, and our own school curriculum celebrates this as well in its new RVE curriculum. And those voices that have not been part of our nation's discourse are increasingly valued and recognised in our nation. So as an aside, I'm also acutely aware of the class background of our workforces and the range of protected characteristics that are not necessarily reflected in our workforce. So it's work around opening up access to our workforce group via a recruitment process that is far more inclusive and equitable. So we wanted to start the journey and take some positive actions. We recognise we're learning, and so we will make mistakes, but this is also around accepting that we do create barriers for people in our processes, and we work to challenge ourselves. Sarah.
Thanks, Alison. So as you can hear, we've been talking about doing a piece of work in this area for a while, and one of the things we talked about looking at is our job descriptions and discussing the types of barriers that they could be presenting unintentionally. But the opportunity to do that really comes when you have a vacancy you need to fill. And we happened to lose one of our academic liaison librarians in the early summer. Not lose, she didn't fall down by the back of the sofa, she moved on. I should clarify that. It sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? But so we had a vacancy last summer. We'd already started toying with the interview process to make it more inclusive. So this was the next step for us. And although we'd always reviewed job descriptions before recruiting, this was a whole new level for us. The job description hadn't been reviewed thoroughly since 2016, and we kind of tinkered around the edges, but not made any big changes. So there were three main aspects to the review process: the main body of the job description, the person spec, and the recruitment process, and we used a number of tools to help us with this. The first was the gender decoder, and it's simply a tool where you cut and paste the text of the job description and it picks up on language that is overtly feminized or masculine. We're quite surprised about some of the vocabulary it brought up. For example, collaborative, commitment, interpersonal are apparently all female words, which says a lot about the state of the world, perhaps. However, the main point of the exercise was to make sure we were not excluding anyone with our language or putting them off. The second tool we used was the University of Salford Library Inclusive Recruitment Checklist. I can share the links to these in the chat at the end. This was really helpful. I would encourage everyone to take a look at it and consider benchmarking your own job descriptions against it. But some of the key things from that were to look at the jargon and the language we use. As librarians, particularly, I'm sure all fields have an element of this, but it's full of off-putting acronyms, specialist language, and we just assume that people will know what we're talking about. And that language and terminology can be a barrier. It's very easy to reword slightly or include hyperlinks to further information where some of the language was necessary. We reduced the length of the person description significantly and really tried to focus it a bit on the key parts of the role. So this helped us to reflect on the key skills and experience we needed for the role. We already include our values in our job descriptions, and you can see those, that the picture on the slide is of where we've got them painted on the wall of one of our buildings. And we wanted to make sure we had the values in there, but we wanted to make sure the document as a whole reflected the culture and the tone that we wanted it to. So moving on to the person spec, this was probably the hardest part because one of the key barriers is the educational requirements. As a profession, we are largely white, middle class, educated people. but we are also often undervalued, underestimated, and subject to damaging stereotypes about our profession. So taking away some of the educational requirements for professional roles or making them merely desirable rather than essential is a bitter pill to swallow. However, that is one of the key things that we did. We asked ourselves honestly, what did we actually need? And were educational qualifications the only way that knowledge or experience might have been gained? We also stepped back and considered what related fields or professions might allow someone to have developed that experience. We talk a lot in libraries about transferable skills, but were we ourselves recognising transferable skills in others? The final part we thought about was the interview process. Now, it's important to recognise that we don't have control over the whole recruitment process. Some parts are completely out of our control. We might also be worried about taking what might be seen as risks by our HR department or senior management. However, there is always something that we can do. And we were lucky in that we have a very supportive HR business partner, so we were able to make the changes we wanted to make. We were also able to influence where our jobs are advertised and ask for additional adverts. So if you are in a position to do this, it gives you an opportunity to think about how you might reach a diverse audience. We made a number of changes to the interview format. So firstly, we decided to provide the candidates with the interview questions in advance. The rationale for this being that putting people on the spot does not get the best from them. There may be situations where you want to see how someone reacts on the spot. However, for the most part, what we actually want to hear is the best answer to the question that the applicant can provide. And we can always use follow-up questions to explore their answer further. This way, when someone gives a bad answer, it's because they didn't know or they didn't prepare. We provided the candidates with a full agenda for the interview, complete with timings, the names of the people involved at our end. We looked at all of the questions from scratch and went back to the person's specification, ensuring that every question related back to what we'd asked for there. We also considered how we might test for transferable skills in the areas that were important to us. We did this by providing reading in advance for some of the questions and by looking at the presentation or activity element of the interview. So for example, we usually ask for a presentation and you get into a cycle where you're asking for a presentation because you've always asked for a presentation and nobody really knows why. So yes, they have their uses. However, we decided to think about what was important to us and how we could best get the candidate to demonstrate their ability. So we decided that the most important skill and experience was teaching experience, whether this was in information literacy or a related field. And so we created an activity to test for the ability to plan and deliver training. Another important skill to us was the ability to advocate for the library and to explain complex issues to academic staff and students. As we decided that we were open to related professions, this poses the issue that candidates cannot be expected to have in-depth knowledge of current issues in libraries. It also made us realise that it wasn't the knowledge that mattered, it was the ability to explain. Therefore, we took e-book publishing models as an example, very complex, and directed candidates to some information about that, and then asked us to explain the issue to us at the interview. Another suggestion from the Salford checklist was to ensure that your interview panel is also diverse. We've always tried to include an external on every interview panel so that we can ensure different perspectives. Generally, this would be a member of non-library staff, for example, a manager from another professional unit, or a member of academic staff. Sometimes someone from another institution. The challenge, though, is finding enough diversity in the institution at the right level to find a more representative panel. So this is something that we will continue working on. So moving on to the outcomes of that work. So there are still areas we'd like to explore further. And we will want to refine the process over the time. We're just really getting started. Looking at the panel, and also perhaps being open with panel members about what we're trying to do is one area. Our experience of the process was very positive though, and it took a little more effort and time to organise, but when you're recruiting, you're embarking on a long-term relationship with a successful candidate. So the big picture is that it's worth making that time. We also involved more members of staff in the process, which really made it feel like more of a collaborative and thoughtful process. And I think we continue to extend that involvement to other staff. After the interview, we also asked the candidates how they felt the experience had been. We were quite open that we tried something new and that their opinions would help us in future, and we're not part of the recruitment decision. How honest people will be with you in that situation, I don't know, but I think it's still important, because you're also saying something about yourselves as an employer by showing willingness to take feedback on board and show that you do care about other people's input. There's a representation of the culture you create in your own workplace. But all in all, we're seeing this as the beginning of the journey. We're not experts, we're just being open and curious. All I would say is, if you're considering doing something like this, think about the benefits to a more diverse workforce and the bigger picture, because there'll be 100 little reasons not to do it. And the risk is that we end up doing nothing at all if we let those little niggles become barriers. I'll hand back to Alison.
After 3 years, I was still on mute, so apologies for that. So just this is just a mock-up of an image, which just goes to show that, to remind ourselves really, that the earliest libraries and the earliest librarians. I lost the slide.
All right, trying to find my links for my gender decoder and my.
Oh, I think someone's put it in the chat anyway, so that's helpful.
Oh, lovely.
So just to remind ourselves that the earliest libraries and librarians weren't white. And so it hasn't always been this way. Our profession hasn't always looked this way. And it's no excuse, as Sarah was touching on, then, well, this is just the way it is. And it would be disingenuous to suggest otherwise. Indeed, it's clear that libraries have been used to reinforce societal barriers for a considerable length of time. For those of you who've seen Hidden Figures, for example, is a good example. Librarians have been part of this, and so it's our unlearning journey and also owning our past as a profession. So this is an image of the Abbasid Library, for those who are aware, which is which was the Grand Library of Baghdad. Interestingly enough, obviously, Baghdad has a new library now, which is equally grand and beautiful. So where do we go from here? So we've, as Sarah touched on, we've got current recruitment going through this processes. We've got an archives officer, 2 archives posts out for recruitment at the moment, currently going through this process. We are using our learning to inform our wider directorate, and our own director is very supportive of this work and encouraging for other areas of the directorate to look at this and in the wider university. So this is a journey, not an end goal. There's always something that can be improved upon. And so the learning is part of the process for us as well. And that's really all we wanted to say. What we wanted to do is then just open it out for questions. I can see questions in the chat, and we thought it might be helpful if we had that opportunity to have that conversation. Thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and also I think fits in well with a lot of things that I'm experiencing in terms of our approach to recruitment in Southampton anyway. I think we've got quite a few questions. Caroline, do you want to start taking us through those?
Yeah, it's a really interesting presentation. Thank you, Alison and Sarah, and so pragmatic as well. So, and that reflects some of the questions, I think, certainly at the beginning of the presentation. So, starting from the top, I wonder how the Welsh language requirements affect diversity. I appreciate that maintaining equity for Welsh speakers, customers and staff is also important.
I don't know, Sarah, whether you want to take this as a Welsh speaker, but we in our person specs, we've always noted that Welsh isn't essential, it's desirable, but also an awareness of the fact that we're a bilingual university. So we are a university that sits in the Welsh nation and has 2 languages. And so what we would do is support someone who wishes to learn the language should they choose to. But my going back to pragmatism is around what Sarah was talking about, the experience and the skills. And in a way, people are interested in learning the language, they can do. So the Welsh language isn't essential for any post that we've actually advertised as a service, probably for about 15 years.
There are also always, it comes back to the looking at what are the skills that are most important to the job as well, doesn't it? Because, you know, the ability to speak Welsh is just, in a way, another skill. And I say this as a first language Welsh speaker. It's important to me to have Welsh speakers in the workforce. But when you're looking at the job description, is the Welsh language, the ability to speak Welsh, important to that role? Is it more important than other things that you need in that role? You know, it's looking at the bigger picture, I suppose. And yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm just wondering if that does at any point lead into any kind of tensions, because obviously being able to have Welsh speakers in the organisation is clearly really important as well, and you're having to juggle a number of different competing demands, perhaps.
Yes, I would. Yes, I mean, Sarah probably better to answer this as a first language Welsh speaker, but I'm not a second language Welsh speaker. But I think we've naturally recruited those who do have Welsh as a first or second language by the nature of our location. Sarah, would you say that? Just sort of happenstance. I'm not sure that's that's not very technical in way of recruiting. But we've also had a number of staff who've chosen to learn the language as well. So being recruited to a university that is bilingual, people make the choice about living in the area, wanting to learn the language, and that's really not just about the job, that's about the lifestyle, I guess, and actually being part of a wider community. So I don't necessarily see it as a conflict as such, because anybody can learn the language, and that's the Welsh Government's agenda, regardless of background, regardless of whether they were born here, regardless of and there's fine examples of Ukrainian refugees and Syrian refugees learning the language because they're either in a community where language is spoken heavily, or the children go to a Welsh language school, which is increasingly the case.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Okay, there's
Caroline.
a couple of kind of process ones now. So first one was about the decoder that you mentioned and the things that were highlighted, and how did you respond to those highlights? And then the second one was about where were the additional places that you advertised the post?
So I say the decoder, Alison. It was it was really interesting. It's like assessing the presentation, the things that it came up with. But what we did was have a group of us, not just one person looking at it and deciding, no, this is not relevant. Yes, this is relevant. So we had a group of us of as diverse as we could get, male and female, looking at that and then making some kind of calls on it. And things like the things that it was coming up with, where you've got overly feminized language, I guess it's looking at the bigger picture. What is the point? Are you actually excluding people, or for example, where we're not going to take out collaborative, we're not going to take out commitment. Anyone who doesn't want to do those things, we don't really want them, and they're not necessarily female qualities. So I think you've got to take it with a pinch of salt. It was really useful. It was really eye-opening, really interesting. But you have got to take it back to the big picture and not just exclude things because it picked things up. You've got to be like, well, why is that come across? Why, can we practically take things out? And I think for us, it was just having that awareness, having those conversations even was part of it. Alison, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that on the decoder.
No, it's quite interesting actually, because I put some of the IT service desk jobs through it, and they came out as feminine as well, which is quite interesting given that they're the exact opposite to our workforce. So yeah, I think it's about context, isn't it? But what it does do is make you think about the language you use, and I think that's that even if you kind of ignore all the kind of advice that it gives you, it's getting you to think about the language you use and why you're using that particular phrase or term. But if I move on to the advertising, that's a really interesting point, because that's there's only so much we can do, because the HR department itself has some challenges, and there have been conversations at a senior level around where roles are advertised. So, for example, the university doesn't use LinkedIn as much as perhaps other universities do, for example. And I think that's a kind of senior level. However, what we've tried to do is, yes, we use our networks, but we use our social media. We do use our own LinkedIn. We just try and get it out there as wide as possible, and try not to keep it within our kind of little vacuum of boundaries. But if anybody's got any advice really on where they think, you know, we perhaps could be or should be advertising, because one of the roles more recently, or some of the roles more recently, have been around digital skills, and Sarah and I have had that conversation about, do we want that advertised on a library webpage because of the preconceived ideas? Do we want people to look at the job without that lens really? And so, yeah, but we kind of came to kind of a stumbling block there. We couldn't quite conceive about where we would advertise it really. But yeah, so if anybody's got any thoughts and been particularly successful, we'd love to hear that.
Thank you. What were the outcomes of the recruitment process in terms of encouraging and increasing diversity?
It does so happen we recruited someone from the global majority for that post that we were, yeah. So in a sense, and we also gave, it was also a post that was given to someone without a qualification who had been doing a huge amount of work in that area, and was being paid at another university on a lower grade because the qualification was a bar. So it was a pretty, yeah, we were pretty happy with what happened, with what happened there, because, you know, it's getting just, you know, the EDI aspect aside, it's getting increasingly competitive amongst institutions for staff. So we were really happy with that. So we were very happy with the result of that. In another post, we recruited somebody who has neurodiversity challenges, who again has been amazing. But I think had she not had the questions in advance, and she gave us some lovely feedback quite recently about how grateful she was for the way we'd approached it, because it's highly possible we wouldn't have recruited her. She wouldn't be in the post if we'd gone down a traditional route. So far, so good, I would say.
I was really interested in feedback mechanism myself, actually. You mentioned that you asked the candidates for feedback. How did you ask them, in terms of, was it written or verbal? I am quite an open person. I'm not very formal. So at the end of the interview, I basically said, look, how did you find that? Because I just came clean. I said, look, this is a new process for us. We've never given anyone the questions before. I hope you can, you know, be honest with us. This is not part of the interview process, but how did you find that? It was really very informal. And I think it's being open to, open to criticism. As I said in the presentation, I'm not convinced that people will be that honest with us in that situation. So again, if anyone's got any advice, because it's really important to get that feedback from the candidates. And but that's that was basically what we did. Any tips, any advice from anyone else who's done that kind of thing and got good feedback from an interview process, we're always happy to hear.
I'd like our web recruitment process to be able to deal with that in some way, but obviously that's something that is out of our influence at the moment. Although we can raise it and add it to a risk register and all that kind of stuff. But that is something that would kind of, I wouldn't close a loop, but it would somehow allow you to capture qualitative data, perhaps to improve, you know, the loop. So that's certainly something that we would like to raise, I think. For the university to look at more formally, but yeah, I can't imagine it's top of their list, if I'm honest.
And maybe it's the other end of the process about encouraging exit interviews, however you capture that feedback as well.
Yeah, the university HR do that, which is only a recent development actually, and so I'm not sure. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I've always thought exit interviews are helpful in a number of ways, but only if we can use the data as part of the recruitment and as part of onboarding and as part of all of that kind of stuff. So hopefully our HR department will be able to kind of share some findings from, you know, once they capture enough exit interview strategy documents.
Thank you. I think, Rick, there were some other questions around, I'm just going back to Kirsten at 9:52, where you were talking about what you were asking of candidates. So her comment is, I think it's a really good point about the ability to explain rather than existing knowledge being important. Often as a librarian, I've had to rapidly learn about something in order to teach it. And there's quite a few comments around that.
Yeah, I don't know, Sarah, whether you want to talk about that. From my perspective, we talk about communication skills often in person specs, and this is a fine example of it, really. This is what we mean. I think Sarah probably can explain more.
Yeah, I mean, just because you have a lot of information about something doesn't mean that you are able to impart that information or explain it to another person. But yeah, as you say, you could learn something really quickly and then be able to explain it really fast. It's we just get perhaps hung up, and we have, you know, we get hung up as a profession perhaps on people having this having all this knowledge of knowing all this stuff that, you know, do they need to?
And actually there's a comment from Sarah Louise, you know, affirming the fact that questions were given in advance to candidates, and one of the candidates who is neurodiverse thanked the panel during the interview for doing that, and it would be a nice place to work based on the fact that the care that was taken into that interview process and that had helped her to relax on the day. There's an interesting point from Kirsten too about, have you had feedback from unsuccessful candidates about the process?
No more than what we've asked during the interview. Yeah, as Alison says, that our HR, yeah, there's not very much opportunity. There's no processes in place to, but, you know, we asked everybody equally, you know, same as any other part of the interview process. And at that point, we don't know whether they're going to be successful or not, but we just asked in the interview everybody the same questions. Just came clean. But yeah, nothing more than that.
Thank you both very much. I think that encapsulates most of the questions. There's lots of other comments around people finding it very interesting, and some shared experiences about providing questions prior to interview and it working well.
Great, thank you. That's been really interesting. I think I've a couple of really key things you picked up for me in terms of very practical things here. The question about where to advertise. Back in the day, of course, we used to advertise in the local paper, and you would be able to connect very easily with your sort of local community. I suppose now I've just thought about that. Of course, that depends if they're all engaging with the local paper itself, but all the same, probably slightly better than at the moment where everything goes on our university jobs website, and you're then limited to people who are actually thinking even of just what work could be available at the university. And the whole question about sort of providing interview questions in advance as well has been interesting. It's an idea I'd only relatively recently come across, and I was struggling a little bit with that myself, as to whether that was a good or bad idea. You know, my initial thought was, well, you know, we've done questions when they do the applications. They've already had some questions in advance, but it's really interesting to see all that really good feedback from it and how positive it is received by some of the candidates. So, you know, I think over time I'm becoming more and more convinced it's the way, you know, a really good way to go, actually. So when I'm lucky enough to be in a position to do my next recruitment, that's definitely something I'll be looking at. Thank you very much. Unless there are any other questions that have come in.
I think there's some good advertising for other events happening.
Oh,
and
yes.
Part of a fair library jobs, there's a link there, so really useful information.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it'd be really good to bring some of that information together and pass that around, actually. I know at University of Southampton we have a what we call a super recruiters program, which is trying to improve the training development for anybody who's involved in the recruiting process across the whole university, and I've taken part in that, and that's been, again, really interesting and eye-opening, and shows that it is something that we're starting across the whole sort of academic area to get our heads around, but clearly a long way to go yet before we're, really nailed it. Thank you very much, both Alison and Sarah. That was really fascinating.